The chair recognizes the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 12 days ago, the eyes of the world were focused on the beaches of Normandy, France, to observe the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. It was a solemn moment to rightly honor the sacrifice and courage of the combined armed forces of the Allies, who from that moment launched the final decisive assault that eventually destroyed the Axis powers' murderous stranglehold on Europe and Asia. Mr. Speaker, another 75th anniversary surrounding the epic effort to save democracy will occur in 4 days this Saturday, June 22nd. On that day, 75 years ago, President Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, more commonly known as the GI Bill. That landmark measure would provide both college tuition and a stipend for returning service members who, as FDR said at the time, quote, have been compelled to make greater economic sacrifice and every other kind of sacrifice than the rest of us. Even though the war would rage on for another year, leaders in Washington wisely recognized that millions of young soldiers, sailors, and airmen would soon be returning back into civilian life. And for their sake and for the sake of a healthy post-war economy, creating this educational pathway made tremendous sense. In the 75 years since the GI Bill was signed into law, it is now recognized as one of the most successful pieces of domestic legislation ever enacted. The post-war economic boom and the blossoming of the American middle class have both been attributed in part to the GI Bill. Many renowned Americans, including Bob Dole, Johnny Carson, Harry Belafonte, William Rehnquist, and Clint Eastwood, were beneficiaries of the GI Bill. Economic studies have shown that for every dollar the government spent on the GI Bill, our economy saw nearly $7 in return of additional economic output and tax revenues from income growth. Despite its stellar performance, the relative strength of the GI Bill deteriorated in the late 20th century. By 2008, it was clear that tuition assistance and living stipends had not kept pace with the rising cost of a college education. As a freshman congressman on the House Armed Services Committee at the time, I heard from returning Iraq and Afghan vets who were forced to choose between dropping out of school or shouldering the burden of daunting student loans. To fix this decline, we passed the post-9/11 GI Bill, which was signed into law by George Bush on June 30th, 2008. The updated law boosted tuition to match the cost of a 4-year public university in service members' home states and increased the living stipend to keep faith with the original law. It also allowed GI benefits to be transferred to a spouse or dependent child, a groundbreaking change which transformed the value of military service for families. After the bill signing, I flew to Iraq in late 2008 for a committee visit and vividly recall being surrounded by soldiers bursting with questions about when and how the new law would be implemented. Since then, it has become clear that the transferability of the GI Bill has been an enormous morale booster and a valuable incentive to enlist and remain in service. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Trump Department of Defense announced a new policy last July, which would arbitrarily cut off service members with more than 16 years of service from transferring their post-9/11 GI benefits to eligible family members. We were told at the time that the department viewed this as a shrewd cost-cutting measure. However, revoking transferability breaks our commitment to our most dedicated and seasoned service members and their families. In addition, in a tightening labor market, it remains critically important to attract and retain the best qualified individuals for military service. And I believe it sends exactly the wrong message to some of our most seasoned service members who may have married late in life or started their families later to make them ineligible for incentives to continue their service to our nation. 2 weeks after the Pentagon released this policy, 83 of my colleagues in the House joined me in a letter that I wrote to Secretary Mattis objecting to this change and calling for its reversal. So far, DOD has refused to budge. Mr. Speaker, I have some good news to report today. With the cutoff due to go into effect next month, the House Armed Services Committee last week unanimously passed my amendment to the 20 National Defense Authorization Act, which would block the Secretary of Defense from restricting GI Bill transferability based on a maximum number of years of service. As Congress took action 75 years ago to create the GI benefit, today it is our job to restore the hard-fought, modernized GI Bill of 2008. This is even more the case today at a time of an all-volunteer force. If a service member demonstrates that they are ready, able, and willing to continue their service to our nation, we should uphold our end of the commitment. To paraphrase President Roosevelt's words 75 years ago when he signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, protecting transferability today, quote, gives emphatic notice to the men and women of our armed forces that the American people do not intend to let them down. I yield back.